Two opposite legends surround the same small gray airplane. In the first, it is the most feared machine of the Pacific War, a fighter so agile that Allied pilots were ordered, in writing, never to turn with it, a shape whose silhouette alone could empty a briefing room of confidence. In the second legend, it is a flying paper lantern, an unarmored firetrap that a single burst could light like a match, proof that its builders valued spectacle over survival. Both legends describe the Mitsubishi Zero. Both are repeated to this day, often by people describing the very same year of the war. So which story is true? The uncomfortable answer is both, and the fascinating part is that they are true for the same reason. This is the story of the Mitsubishi Zero, the fighter that was neither invincible nor junk, but a single, enormous bet, placed once and never taken back. But this story does not start with a legend. It starts with a shopping list that read like a joke. In the late 1930s, the Japanese Navy handed its aircraft industry a set of demands for a new carrier fighter. It wanted the agility of the nimblest biplanes, the speed of the newest monoplanes, heavy twin-cannon armament, and the range to escort bombers across distances no single-seat fighter on Earth could then cover. One manufacturer looked at the list and effectively declined. At Mitsubishi, the job landed on a soft-spoken engineer named Jiro Horikoshi, and he faced an arithmetic problem no cleverness could dodge. The engines available to Japan produced roughly half the horsepower that American industry would soon be bolting onto its fighters. Range, speed, agility, firepower. With a small engine, the list was impossible, unless something enormous was thrown off the scale. What Horikoshi threw off was weight, and with it, protection. One detail in that decision explains everything that follows. The Zero carried no armor plate behind its pilot. Its fuel tanks had no self-sealing rubber lining, the layer that lets a punctured tank close around a bullet hole instead of streaming fuel. The airframe was skinned in a brand new aluminum alloy, an extra super duralumin developed for the project, shaved thin enough that a mechanic pressing hard could flex it. Some squadrons went further still and pulled the radios out, judging the sets too heavy for what they offered. In plain terms, the Zero traded the pilot's protection for the pilot's reach. Every kilogram of shielding a Western fighter carried, the Zero converted into fuel and turning ability. The result, in 1940, was a carrier fighter that could fly missions of a length no one else could contemplate, outturn anything that rose to meet it, and climb like the laws of loading had been suspended. Japan could imagine armor perfectly well. Armor was simply the stake the whole bet had been placed with. And for about 18 months, the bet paid out in full. Over China in 1940, the new fighter swept the sky so completely that reports reaching Washington were dismissed as exaggeration. Then came December 1941. Zeros flew top cover over the Pearl Harbor strike, and within weeks, the dismissed exaggeration was escorting bombers from the Philippines to the East Indies, sweeping British, Dutch, and American types from the sky, appearing over targets hundreds of miles from any base the Allies thought could threaten them. The range was doing something subtler than winning fights. It was warping the map, putting Japanese fighters over places where, by every Western planning table, no fighter could be. In the turning fight, the results were lopsided enough that Allied commands issued the order that built the first legend: do not dogfight the Zero. Do not turn with it. If it gets on the tail, dive and run. For a carrier fighter of 1940, that standing order from enemies was the highest compliment aviation could pay. Up to this point, the Zero had been collecting on its bet with nothing but winnings. That was about to flip, because the same ledger that bought the legend had a debit column, and the enemy was learning to read it. A Zero that could be hit was a Zero that tended to die. Tracer rounds walking into an unsealed wing tank did not leave a leak. They left a torch, and Allied gun camera footage filled with the same abrupt bloom of flame, so routine that American pilots coined casual names for it. There was no armor plate to catch the fragment that mattered, no redundancy to forgive a wound, and the aerobatic brilliance had a boundary written in airspeed. Past roughly 300 miles per hour, the Zero's beautifully light controls turned to stone. The ailerons stiffened, until the fighter that danced at low speed could barely roll out of the way at high speed. The airplane had been optimized for one kind of fight so totally that it carried, built into its own wings, the instructions for beating it. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in 1940 could have expected, because the answer arrived on 3 separate fronts within a single year, and the first front was a man at a kitchen table. In the autumn of 1941, an American naval aviator named John Thach sat with matchsticks and a lamp, working through intelligence reports about an impossibly agile Japanese fighter. He could not outturn it, so he stopped trying, and designed a maneuver in which 2 American fighters wove across each other's paths, each dragging any pursuer through the other's guns. At Midway, in June 1942, the weave worked on its first combat outing. The lesson under it was brutal for Japan. The Zero's advantage evaporated the moment its enemies refused, as a team, to fight the fight it was built for. That same month, on a soggy island in the Aleutians, a Zero flown by a young petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga flipped over in a forced landing, killing its pilot and delivering the airframe nearly intact. The Akutan Zero was shipped home, repaired and flown against American types, and its every stiff aileron and fragile tank was written into training notes. The legend says the captured Zero unlocked the war. The record is more modest, and this channel sides with the record. The fighter that ended the Zero's reign was already being designed before Koga's crash. What Akutan really killed was the mystery. And then came the third blow, the one with no cleverness in it at all. The Grumman Hellcat arrived in 1943, carrying a 2,000 horsepower engine, roughly double the muscle behind the Zero's faithful little sake, and wearing armor, sealed tanks, and structure the Zero's designers could only have bought by inventing a bigger engine that Japan did not have. It is worth pausing on that, because the sake itself was never the villain. The little radial was reliable to a fault, running on thin fuel across ocean distances without complaint. The sake's only sin was its size, and a small engine sets a hard ceiling on everything built around it. American pilots were told, in effect, to fight in the vertical, dive, shoot, climb away, and never linger. The bet was now perfectly legible to both sides, and only one side was still bound by it. The collapse, when it came, was not gradual. Over the Marianas in June 1944, American fleet fighters met the massed remnants of Japanese carrier aviation, and the engagement entered history under a nickname too cruel to repeat as analysis. Post-war American tallies credited the Hellcat with kill ratios that read like typographical errors. But the number that actually decided the Pacific Air War hung on no scoreboard and appeared on no fuselage. It was the count of trained men, and each side kept that ledger very differently. Japan had entered the war with a corps of carrier pilots trained through one of the most selective programs on Earth, a system that produced airmen of extraordinary quality in quantities that were, by industrial war standards, a rounding error. And the Zero's ledger came due here with compound interest, because every unarmored cockpit and every burning unsealed tank subtracted from a pool that Japan had no machinery to refill. The veterans flew without rotation until they were killed. Their American counterparts went home and became instructors, multiplying themselves into the tens of thousands of new pilots pouring out of stateside fields. By the Marianas, Japan was sending students against graduates, young men with a fraction of the flight hours their opponents logged in training alone, strapped into a fighter whose one demand, exquisite piloting, was the one thing the system could no longer supply. The airplane in which they died was by then almost beside the point. Almost, but not entirely. And here is the verdict this channel keeps arriving at from different directions. The Zero was not a bad airplane. In 1940 it was, by the mission it was designed for, arguably the finest carrier fighter in existence. And the bet behind it was not madness, but the only rational answer to a small engine and a vast ocean. The indictment is not the design, it is the calendar. The fighter that stunned the world in 1940 was still Japan's frontline fighter in 1944, upgraded in fractions, while its enemies replaced whole generations of aircraft around it. Its intended successor never escaped the prototype stage in time to matter. The industry that should have delivered a bigger engine and a second bet delivered neither. The Zero did not fail Japan. Japan failed to relieve the Zero. And in the war's last year, the airframe built to be the longest arm of the fleet was loaded with a bomb and a volunteer and expended against ship hulls, more of them than any other Japanese type, the final and darkest entry in a ledger that had begun, only 5 years earlier, with a shopping list nobody could fill. Today, of the more than 10,000 Zeros built, more than any other Japanese warplane, a few dozen survive, resting in museums from Tokyo to Texas. A tiny handful still fly. And most of those that do carry a quiet correction under their cowlings, because the original engines are all but gone. The airshow Zeros bank over the crowds, graceful as the legend says, powered by American Pratt & Whitney radials. The most feared silhouette of the Pacific War still flies. It just borrows its heartbeat from the industry that outbuilt it.